Okay, good evening, everybody. So my name is Horace Luana, I'm the Associate Dean of Student Experience. I'm also a senior instructor in the Department of Chemistry. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the Robin Connor Lectureship in this History and Philosophy of Science. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made in the past on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The Robin Connor Lectureship in the History and Philosophy of Science was established and endowed by Dr. Robin Connor, a former member of the Department of Physics and also the founding dean of the Faculty of Science, and served in the capacity from 1970 to 1979. Prior to 1970, the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science were one faculty, and Dr. Connor saw this as a meaningful opportunity to bring the arts and science communities together by inviting international scholars who have made outstanding contributions in interpreting science in its broadest terms. Professor Robin Connor was not only a dedicated scientist and educator in his field of physics, but he was also interested in the history of science. Dr. Connor passed away in 2017, but before that time, he regularly attended these lectures along with his wife, Dr. Sylvia Connor. And this evening we have Dr. Connor's son, David and Graham, with us. Thank you for supporting, and thank you for your family supporting this important lectureship. I have the enormous pleasure of introducing the Robin Connor Lecturer for 2022-2023, Professor Erica Charters. Professor Charters completed a Bachelor of Humanities at Carleton University, a Master's in History at the University of Toronto, and then a Doctorate of History at the University of Oxford. Professor Charters is currently Professor of Global History of Medicine in the Faculty of History. Since 2016, she has been a Director of Oxford Center for Global History and has helped transform the Oxford's history faculty into the institution's most productive research centers. From 2018 to 2022, she was the Director of Oxford Center for the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology, which was a hub for multidisciplinary research. She is currently the academic lead for medical humanities at the University of Oxford. Professor Charters is a historian of medicine, and her research examines the relationship between disease and society. She has a particular interest in the role of disease during colonial war, and also studies the history of quantitative approaches of disease and health, including statistics, population health, disease modeling, and mortality statistics. Professor Charters' work has been awarded the American Association for the History of Medicine George Rosen Prize, and the Society for Army Historical Research Templar Medal for Best First Book, as well as various fellowships and public engagement awards. She led a multidisciplinary project titled How Epidemics End, which brought together a range of researchers from around the world and drew on a variety of methodological insights and experiences of previous epidemics to examine the ways in which epidemics have ended in previous eras and locations. Professor Charters is with us today and tomorrow to give two presentations, coinciding with the marking of the 3rd anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic just over a week ago. This evening, Professor Charters will be delivering a timely lecture titled How Epidemics End, where she shares some of her team's findings. And then tomorrow she will present a lecture titled Excess Death, Counting the Costs of 18th Century War, Disease, and Empire, which she will present some of her more recent work. I would like to invite you to that lecture as well. That's in Fletcher RU 200 at 3 p.m. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Professor Charters.
Thank you very much, Horace. I just want to say a big thank you to the Faculty of Sciences, also, of course, to the Connor family, and especially a thank you to Nicole and to Horace for all their kind work in organizing my time here. It's a great honor for me to be giving the Connor lectures and to get to visit the University of Manitoba, and really to be meeting so many wonderful students and faculty today and also tomorrow. So as Horace mentioned, what I'm discussing today is the result of a multidisciplinary project that I started in December of 2020 called How Epidemics End. And so the project brings together around 30 researchers who work on a variety of epidemics, really from all over the world, but also researchers who are looking at epidemics from different disciplines. So there's epidemiologists, there's biologists, archaeologists, historians, political scientists, but all are trying to answer this question of how does an epidemic end? And more specifically, the project has been designed as a multidisciplinary project, so not really an interdisciplinary project, but rather multidisciplinary, in that it suggests that there are multiple endings to an epidemic, and that also different disciplines define ending in different ways, and indeed measure different criteria to define an end. So I want to underline that rather than envisioning the project as providing a kind of clear answer on how epidemics end, it's framed as one that analyzes and compares methodology. So it's thinking about where these things diverge, where they disagree, and it thus also raises the issue of disciplinary expertise and authority. So this project is very much thinking about methodologies. What are the methodologies that we use to measure and to gauge and to define an epidemic's end? And therefore, the project takes a kind of macro, or what I might call a bird's eye view of epidemics and of research on epidemics across time and across places, as well as across disciplines. So this evening, it's very much my pleasure to discuss the findings of this multidisciplinary project with you. Along with a range of video interviews and podcasts, the project has a special issue of 25 articles, all written from a variety of disciplinary perspectives that was recently published, and everything is openly available, open access on the project's website. What the project found is a number of points. First and foremost, very few pay attention to the process of an epidemic's end. And indeed, when we look at most studies, they've actually ignored the process of an ending. I think probably more eager to look ahead to the future, or perhaps even eager to forget the difficulties that everyone has just gone through. But when we do focus on the end of an epidemic, it becomes clear that we need to distinguish between the end of an epidemic and the end of disease. More generally, when we ask, how does an epidemic end, we're asking, when will this disease stop disrupting our lives and allow a return to normalcy? This is in fact three related but different endings. There's the ending of disease, or what I call the medical end. There's the end of the crisis and regulations, which I call the political end. And then there's the return to normalcy, which I call the social end. What this means is that a fundamental finding of the project is that the end of an epidemic is a process. So unlike what we often assume to be a kind of single, quick event, an epidemic's end is a long, drawn-out, and contested process in which experts debate what is measured, how these measurements should be interpreted, and who has the expertise to assess and declare that an epidemic has ended. So whereas the declaration of an outbreak of an epidemic suggests a neatly defined period of emergency, the end process is a very messy process. It incorporates competing accounts of what went wrong, as well as fears of the next epidemic. So during this process of ending, we have cycles of multiple diseases and overlapping social crises that disrupt a simple return to normal life. And this articulates the nature of epidemics not just as medical phenomena, but also as fundamentally political and social. The end of an epidemic therefore reveals what may initially sound like a paradox, but in reality is crucial to understanding the nature of epidemics. That epidemics are not just about a biological pathogen, but rather are fundamentally about humans. So, first, what do we find when we start looking through the many records of previous epidemics and their endings? Once you start researching epidemics, what's striking is how little attention is paid to the process of an epidemic's end. So in a seminal series of articles that was written during the AIDS pandemic, the historian Charles Rosenberg explained how epidemics are fundamentally about uncertainty. Not only medical uncertainty, but also social and political uncertainty. During an epidemic, our normal framework for understanding the world, for who we can trust and what we should do, is suddenly undermined. As a result, societies respond through a set of cultural patterns of rituals and of communal behavior. We create communities focused on those rituals, which also necessarily excludes others who do not join in. These rituals and these exclusive communities help us to manage the sense of randomness by providing us with a sense of control within our world of uncertainty. In other words, epidemics follow an arc of social drama. They start with a stage of revelation as we begin to understand the nature of the problem. They move through a period of managing that randomness, and then into a period of collective action to assert control before finally drifting towards closure. Now, an example of this drift towards closure can be found in what is a seminal account of an epidemic for Western history and also for literature, which is Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens in 430 BCE. Now, much has been written and debated as to what disease Thucydides describes, as well as its mortality rates and its social consequences, but it's widely agreed that this is a foundational epidemic narrative. That is, many have pointed out that later accounts of epidemics have this kind of eerie habit of repeating what it is that Thucydides' account records. So it appears to shape not only our later telling of epidemics, but it also shapes what we look for and what we consider important enough to be recorded as an epidemic unfolds. So it's significant to understand how Thucydides recounts the end of this devastating plague. After he describes the symptoms, the deaths, the social dislocation, the economic devastation, and the political upheaval that's caused by this plague, the disease simply disappears from his text. So it's mentioned as all-encompassing in distressing terms, but then it is gone. And I want to underline this. Thucydides does not mention a decline in cases, nor even the process of returning to normality. Instead, the disease simply disappears from his narrative. Disease has exited the stage without further comment, and other actors silently take its place. In other words, we, the readers, know that the epidemic is over because it's no longer part of the plot. In many ways, this silence is fundamental to the very definition of the end of an epidemic. After all, an epidemic is a crisis, not only a biological crisis, but also a social and political crisis, during which time society's attention is focused on this urgent problem of disease and the drama of its unfolding. The end of an epidemic is therefore when the drama ceases, when society's attention is no longer focused on the crisis of disease. When we examine research on epidemics, there's a similar tendency to neglect this end stage. There's a tremendous amount of research on origins, on tracing and tracking transmission patterns, and on the climax of an epidemic. Yet by contrast, there's very little analysis on what it means for an epidemic to end. Most often, the end of an epidemic is relegated to a brief conclusion or even an afterword, often titled lessons learned. And so in other words, with attention already pivoting away from the end itself. In part, as we can see with Thucydides, this is the result of the very evidence. The very definition of an end of an epidemic is when public attention is redirected elsewhere, an indication that this urgent problem of disease has been resolved, and so when people stop keeping records about the epidemic. But this pattern also holds in fields beyond history, such as in mathematical modeling of infectious disease. So as a recent epidemiological modeling paper points out, while many works have focused on the growth, peak, and controlled phases of epidemics, much less studied are what are called the tail end dynamics of an epidemic. As a result, the paper concludes, there is still much we do not know about the dynamics of an outbreak as it approaches its end. So I think it's interesting to note, as you can see here, how the statistical charts of cases, the epidemic curve, the epi curve that's so ubiquitous in visualizations of what's called the epidemic's life cycle, provide this underlying temporal framework that mirrors society's account of a narrative of origin, climax, and then drift to closure. So much of this project was designed to focus our attention back as researchers to the processes of an end. And when we do focus on the process of an ending, what it becomes clear is that we need to distinguish between the end of an epidemic and the end of disease. Although a few select epidemics, such as SARS, have been declared ended when cases among humans ceased, most epidemics have not concluded through the end of the disease. Instead, most epidemics are declared to have ended while cases of disease still continued. So this was the case with the very recent 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. Some of you may remember that. It was declared ended not because cases ceased, but because it was in what was called a post-pandemic phase of influenza. This was also the case with 19th century cholera epidemics and also with early modern plague epidemics. So as a result, epidemics, and particularly their endings, can thus only be understood within a broader context of continuing disease. Influenza A, or the flu, with its various strains in circulation throughout the world, is a classic example of a disease that rises to epidemic, that is to problematic levels, and then returns to endemic, or what are often called acceptable levels, but in unpredictable waves ever since it first appeared among human populations in the late 1500s. So given that an epidemic is defined as an increase in incidence beyond usual rates, the end too is clinically defined as the reduction of disease incidence, prevalence, morbidity, or mortality to a locally acceptable level to achieve what is widely described as disease control. But this ambiguous terminology of acceptable and control demonstrates this status is necessarily achieved through a process of negotiation between different, if not competing, interests. This, I would suggest, is why the end is so contentious. Who gets to decide when the level of disease is at a locally acceptable level? And hence, a key point to make is that the end process is not only about pathogens, but most fundamentally about what to measure. The end is most often a contentious debate where different methodologies measure different things, raising issues of competing disciplinary authority. More generally, as I noted, the end of an epidemic consists of three related but different endings: the end of disease, or the medical end, the end of the crisis and regulations, or the political end, and the return to normalcy, or the social end. The medical and political and social ends are overlapping, but they are also different, and they're sometimes even conflicting ends to the one epidemic, as different groups define the ending differently, depending on what is being measured and what is being prioritized. So I have 2 points that I want to highlight in what remains. The first is the central role of data, as the end process highlights the crucial role of information and measurement in how contemporaries and how scholars understand and define epidemics. The second point is about time, as the end process forces observers to rethink and reconceptualize time. The end period, therefore, looks both forward and backwards. It often applies lessons learned from the history of the ended epidemic to the future or the next outbreak. Re-envisioning the future is a way to analyze and understand the past epidemic, and thereby, as part of the end process, we attempt to restore human agency into society's relationship with disease. Now, this document here is one of the earliest examples I've found so far of a declared end to an epidemic. In 1645 to 1646, the English market town of Colton suffered from a devastating plague epidemic. It lost 20% of its entire population, a remarkably high death rate. This grim death toll was documented through a careful list of church burials. So over 13 months, handwriting cataloged the names of the 400 or so who were buried in the churchyard during the epidemic. This was a 7-fold increase in Colton's normal death rate. So after 10 pages of these names, just a few entries after the death of Marie Stevens, daughter of Anne Stevens' widow, in November of 1646, the left margin shows the scrawl, "Here the sickness ended." You can just make it out right here. So after an exact tally of deaths, an observation that tracks a decline of cases identifies the end, precisely inserted to mark out a clear-cut end to the crisis that engulfed the town of Colton. Yet, the closer that we examine this observation, the less definite it becomes. As a 19th century historian identified, the marginalia's handwriting belongs to someone called John Wilkins, who moved to Colton in 1647. In other words, his scrawled declaration is certainly a retrospective diagnosis of the end. It was recorded at the very earliest a full year after the epidemic's supposed end. So Colton's burial records demonstrate how, on the one hand, it's the data that guides us to define an end. And yet, as Wilkins' observation reminds us, on the other hand, most definitions are most easily done in retrospect. In the midst of a disease outbreak, it can be difficult to know what data is crucial to the declaration of an end, with many often complaining of a data deluge, whether in the 17th century or today. More specifically, although quantitative methods such as mathematical modeling are most often assumed to be the most reliable forms of modern knowledge to understanding an epidemic, it's also become increasingly clear that such modeling is itself contested and perhaps even unreliable in its ability to predict. For Colton's 17th century plague, it was much easier to pinpoint the end of the plague once it had disappeared from the records than to observe its decline in the midst of the outbreak. So as the epidemiologist Lorenz von Seinlin explained in defining the end of modern-day cholera epidemics when I interviewed him for the project, he said, "You have to wait for a year and then look back at your epidemic curve. It's something that you decide in retrospect." In part, of course, this is because a decline in cases may not mean an outbreak has ended, as epidemics often follow cyclical patterns, and thus a decline could signal a coming increase as much as an end. And indeed, when we read contemporaneous records from the end of an epidemic, what is clear is that the strongest sentiment is not that the end has fully and mercifully arrived, although there are often celebrations and days of Thanksgiving, but instead it's the sentiment that there's an expectation that this is but a pause before the next wave returns. So when what we now know is the last outbreak of plague in England in the 1670s, for example, no one at the time appears to have recognized the pattern of decline in cases and mortality as the end of plague. Instead, authors of 17th century medical treatises saw plague outbreaks as part of visible, traceable epidemic patterns that stretched from the past into the future. Their writings on plague thus appeared to be timeless rather than time-bound. Now, when plague struck France in 1720, England reasoned that it was indeed about to experience a return of the plague. As the historian Paul Slack observes, there were vigorous debates over quarantine and contagion that took place throughout the 1720s as England prepared itself for the plague that was sure to come. But when it did not, plague had indeed ended in England in the 1680s. But it was only in the late 18th century that English writers, now comfortable with 100 years without plague, began in earnest to explain why they were inherently plague-free, a result that the English now took to be the obvious outcome of English improvements. Likewise, the famous modern epidemiologist Major Greenwood, when he was writing his comprehensive report on the 1918 influenza epidemic in 1920, candidly stated that it was highly probable that destructive epidemics or pandemics of respiratory disease will recur during this present generation. Only later, of course, when a deadly wave of the epidemic did not materialize, was the 1918 pandemic understood as having ended. Yet predictions, of course, can also go the other way, as is the case of the 3 end declarations regarding Ebola in 2015 and 2016 in West Africa. And I won't go over this in detail, but I'm happy to talk about it more in questions. But I think it's a very useful model for thinking about the limits of modeling to official end declarations, as well as the vulnerability of such declarations. In case you don't know, what happened is the WHO declared the end of Ebola 3 times in a row. As each end declaration, they found new cases. And what I think is interesting is to look at the language and how it shifts, to go from Ebola-free to the end of Ebola transmission, to how now they know that Ebola is going to continue. As one reporter said, at the 3rd end declaration, there were no more free t-shirts being handed out that said, "No Ebola." In the case of the end of plague in 17th century England, because plague continued on the European continent, some theorize that the end of plague in England must be the result of English environmental and social reforms, or what one English author at the time proudly described as our own change of manners, our love of cleanliness and ventilation. So the end of an epidemic is as much a political accomplishment as a medical event. So for these English writers, after years of integrating plague into their local and national histories, once plague disappeared from its shores, it was described as a foreign object, one which could be held at bay through English customs and English national policies. Likewise, as the historian Xiaoping Fang described for the case of 20th century China on the project, epidemics are political crises as much as they are medical problems. Political considerations, particularly the danger that epidemic diseases pose to political legitimacy, therefore shaped how epidemics were handled and reported. Political authorities either publicly celebrated a quick end to an outbreak or kept the extent and details of more problematic outbreaks secret, recognizing that epidemics can undermine a government's public image and authority, both at home and internationally. In this context, as he points out, charting the end of an epidemic is difficult because data on disease prevalence and control are collected, reported, framed, and archived by those same political authorities. So an insight provided by focusing on the end process of epidemics has to do with the relationship between data and understanding, or data and knowledge. Although we are no less hungry for data and information at the end stage, there is reason to wonder whether what is widely described as the data deluge produced by medical practitioners, researchers, and public health officials on epidemics, whether it actually helps societies to conduct the political and social negotiations that characterize the ending of epidemics. Epidemics generate enormous amounts of information. Yet as contemporaries point out today, as well as in the past, these flows of information do not provide more certain knowledge, but often can even increase uncertainty. As an account of the 2009 pandemic pointed out, it has become increasingly apparent to everyone working in public health that more information is not, in fact, necessarily better information. Yet the form of this information has changed, with implications for how we understand disease. So early modern European burial records and bills of mortality as featured here were indeed analyzed, but historians rightly contrast those information records with the development of modern methods of what is called epidemic intelligence or disease surveillance. These modern methods practice what's called a continued watchfulness over disease rather than trying to establish a causal determination. So as a result, early modern practices of disease surveillance and health security assume probability rather than certainty. Moreover, disease thereby becomes a problem of mobility within a global system in which humans are more akin to organic entities, such as livestock, which are screened for infection and described at population level, as with the example of herd immunity, and thereby humans are removed from their social, industrial, and environmental contexts. So I'd like to suggest that this end process helps to highlight our dependence on information, but it also raises profound questions as to what we measure and what we don't measure when collecting this information, as well as who collects this information and how that shapes our understanding of the outbreak as well as the end. And I want to emphasize this point as I think one repeated mantra that circulates about how to prevent the next pandemic is the claim that more data would provide better guidance. The second concept I want to discuss is that of temporality. So as Wilkins' retrospective declaration shows about the ending of Colton's plague in 1646, the end of an epidemic encourages us observers to rethink and reconceptualize time. Not only does our understanding of the epidemic change by the end from what was forecast at the outset, but the end process also involves a rethinking of earlier linear narratives of time and causality. Now, what I'm saying here is not just a reminder that the crisis of an epidemic, the political and the social and the economic crises do not end just because disease rates slow down. I think scholars have long noted, for example, that most pandemics have ended at different times in different places. If we look at the second plague pandemic, for example, it receded from Europe, but most of the world did not experience anything such as an end. And in fact, the second plague pandemic in many parts of the world simply melds into the third plague pandemic. This means that, depending on what is measured and what is used as evidence, the end of an epidemic can stretch in many different directions. For example, we've had recent analyses of demographic and economic data from the second plague pandemic, and this has stretched its own endpoint. The economist Guido Alfani has conducted this detailed analysis of 17th century plague in northern Italy. His argument is that this demonstrates a demographic loss to laboring populations that acted as a system shock to Italian economies, and a system shock that persisted for some 70 to 80 years. Although these economies gradually recovered, in the meantime, other European urban centers accelerated. As a result, Alfani points out that by the 18th century, Italy had become an economic backwater. More fundamentally, the economists suggest that we need to think about an epidemiological poverty trap to understand the prevalence of the second plague pandemic, in which an epidemic increases poverty and overcrowding, thus leading to further outbreaks and further declines as a way to understand modern geopolitics. Likewise, Simikai Chigadu, who's Associate Professor of African Politics at Oxford, explains how his analysis of the 2008 Zimbabwe cholera epidemic is fundamentally shaped by what is used as evidence. Although he was trained as a medic, Chigadu points out that patterns of disease can only be understood through their social and political context. As he explains, accounts of cholera epidemics that define its cause through the contamination of water ignore the epidemic's more fundamental cause, which are the political factors that produced these dysfunctional water systems, and explain how and where disease spreads. So as Dr. Jerry Kuvyata long ago stated, the cause of cholera is to be found not in biology, but in poverty. Cholera, according to this analysis, is a political crisis caused by politics, shaped by politics, and its repeated outbreaks explained by politics, while also further eroding political trust. So as Chigadu explained to me in 2021, he said, in a manner of speaking, the 2008 cholera outbreak has never ended, as political fragmentation and dysfunction continue to reign in Zimbabwe and thereby shape repeated disease outbreaks. More fundamentally, the end process demonstrates that although epidemics are triggered as biological events, they are also profoundly social and political phenomena. Tracking pathogens and analyzing virulence can only partly explain the unfolding of epidemics and the uneven dynamics of their ending. For example, we might all know that HIV/AIDS has been transformed into a manageable chronic disease, especially due to medical innovations, and is thus no longer an epidemic for those in the global north. Yet for many in the world who live with political and economic instability and cannot access sustained health and social care, the epidemic of HIV/AIDS has not ended. Epidemics therefore end at different times for different groups, even within one society. And yet the political, economic, and social context of one epidemic's end can fundamentally shape the proximity of other endings. Indeed, medical treatments that are easily available in one part of the world can delay endings in other regions. They often push diseases such as HIV/AIDS out of the spotlight, making its end even more elusive for those in the so-called global south. So as the anthropologist Christiana Bastos remarked on the project, medical treatments, whether pharmaceuticals or vaccines, shape supposedly decisive endings into elusive works in process, what she called an asymptotic quasi-end, a fading away from public concern. In places such as Kenya, COVID-19 therefore interacted with ongoing outbreaks of Ebola, cholera, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis to create what one researcher describes as one long epidemic with no end in sight. The literary scholar Arthur Rose therefore usefully distinguishes between ending and closure. Drawing on narratology and the philosophy of history, he points out that a disease might be eradicated while leaving no firm feeling of finality for those who continue to bear its scars. Likewise, the scholar Einar Viggen has analyzed the temporality of epidemics, pointing out that how the outbreak, or at least the declaration of an outbreak, is easy to locate in time. It serves as a single event that can synchronize our experiences, as we've just talked about in terms of the anniversary of the declaration of the outbreak. By contrast, the unfolding of an epidemic takes place on diverging timescales. There's the lifetimes of microbes that are measured in seconds and minutes, outpacing those of human beings who are measured in days and weeks and months. And then there's the ever even slower moving human institutions, which struggle during disease outbreaks to catch up to and adapt to the speed of the spread of pathogens and to the reactions and adjustments of the human populations. The end of an epidemic is therefore necessarily asynchronous. It involves human beings chasing after lightning-fast biological developments and those slow-moving bureaucracies following suit later on. An epidemic, therefore, also ends when society reunites. It reconvenes its various segments that have become increasingly fragmented through the differentiated experience of illness, but also through divisive public health regulations. For the end of plague epidemics in Renaissance Italy, the historian Samuel Cohn described these lavish public celebrations as featured here that included the foundation of churches, public processions, poetry, song, and fireworks. Those attending were always amazed at the great throng of people attending that had survived the plague. And I think it's quite touching how these celebrations actually occur on an annual basis and had to be temporarily suspended during COVID. So if we return to Charles Rosenberg's classic analysis of epidemics, right, he outlines 3 acts in the process of an epidemic. There's the revelation, the managing randomness, the collective action. But the epidemic drama ends with an epilogue in which society focuses on lessons and on reforms. In similar fashion, the anthropologists Sheila Lindenbaum and Alice Desclos add what they call a post-epidemic period, which is crucial in creating meaning for the epidemic. So as the intensity of the drama declines, reflective narratives of the epidemic provide retrospective accounts in which the epidemic's final significance retroactively shapes memory of its beginnings, it points to heroes and to villains, and it identifies ways to prevent such crises in the future. This messy and contested end process of an epidemic is a reminder that epidemics are not a series of discrete biological events that simply pass into history. They're also moral crises. They test the limits of social cohesion and trust. The end process is thus a period also of moral reckoning. In this stage, societies look both backwards and forwards as the past epidemic is reinterpreted as a morality tale that will help to prevent future catastrophes. This process identifies the lessons learned. It identifies and it explains past failures to control disease, and it also restores faith in the ability of institutions to do better in the future. More important, it restores a sense of human agency. It establishes that the ravages of disease that the society experienced were a product of human decision-making, maybe criminal negligence, perhaps political intransigence, perhaps bureaucratic failure or heroic sacrifice in scientific endeavors, rather than of humanity being powerless in the face of disease outbreaks. Thus, the end stage restores faith in the ability of human agency to face the power of nature. In many ways, this aligns with how we generally approach epidemics, whether we're scholars or whether we're people living through an epidemic. This here is a slide from the website, The Visual Capitalist. It provides data graphics as part of its mission to make the world's information more accessible. And even if you haven't seen this particular image, I'm sure you've seen a variation on it, perhaps even in written form, which shows this format of listing major disease outbreaks in chronological order. This one here starts with the Antonine Plague in the Roman Empire. Then we have the Black Death, smallpox, cholera, HIV/AIDS. It places all of these major pandemics in chronological order, with each spiky circle representing the numbers of deaths, culminating in a still growing red ball at the front to capture the mortality of COVID-19. And although I think it might be unnerving to see the large numbers who've died from past pandemics, overall, this image of the history of pandemics is generally reassuring to those of us placed at its front. After all, COVID-19 appears at the end of a long list of biological calamities that have been solved. It's comparably much smaller in size, and thus as yet simply another test of human and scientific ingenuity. Now, such a framework of history of a long chain of epidemics that break out and then end allows us to place our most current epidemic into a long-term historical context. This representation of past epidemics make history not only interesting for the general public, maybe also for scientists, but it also makes history predictive. It fits the current epidemic into a linear narrative in which humans have always, in the end, conquered each disease. More specifically, the outline here argues for epidemics as discrete disease entities. Plague, for example, is represented through a circle of the Black Death. But of course, it would be more realistic to portray the second plague pandemic in which plague repeatedly exploded, receded, and then returned in something more like waves. In other words, plague isn't a contained sphere with a clear start and a firm end, but something more like a long wavy line, thicker in some points than others, weaving back and forth, but ever present and only occasionally rising and exploding above the surface in humans. Again, if we return to this slide, note that endemic disease appears not at all. Tuberculosis, for example, which explains the pattern of HIV/AIDS, is not featured here. In other words, there's no space for interaction between diseases that is often so crucial to understanding the fluctuation of epidemics. Instead, the focus is on epidemics as isolated events throughout time. What I'm suggesting here is that this representation is a product of a fixation on outbreaks and climaxes of epidemics. By contrast, when we focus on endings, this clarifies that epidemics generally do not end. They certainly do not disappear firmly or abruptly. Instead, they generally become endemic or they meld into the next outbreak. This is my attempt at trying to come up with a different visualization. This is just a visualization of a sound wave. I'm a historian, not a visual artist, I should say. So medical, social, and political endings are therefore all crucial parts of the end of an epidemic, but they're necessarily different, and they often occur in different times and in different forms. This also explains why various methodological approaches assess ending in different ways. They disagree about precisely when an epidemic ends, but also what evidence should be used to ascertain its end. Indeed, tensions between disciplinary understandings of disease are part of this process of an epidemic. While scientific analysis tends to focus on universal models and theories, humanities scholarship emphasizes the specificity of time, of culture, and of place. As a result, medical endings focus on disease in terms of pathogens and populations, often relying on models drawn from animal husbandry and from abstract collectives. By contrast, anthropologists and historians are drawn to the unique experience of individuals, the ways in which cultural behavior disrupts models, and the role of human agency in political resistance, or the ingenious human ability to go back and retrospectively reinterpret the epidemic. We understand disease differently at the end stage. If in the outbreak stage we could channel that end stage understanding of disease, it might help us to reframe and rethink our long-term approach to managing disease. Focusing on endings encourages us to see an epidemic as a process that needs to be contextualized within continuing cycles of disease. The messy process of ending demonstrates that epidemics should not be visualized as a great series of individual and self-contained events that disrupt society's natural trajectory, but instead as continuous waves that interact both with one another and with society. Epidemics are only one part of a world of emerging and submerging diseases that co-evolve with human society, often more akin to icebergs in which we see only the tip above water with the mass of disease and human activity hidden below. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Charles. So I think we do have a few moments to answer questions if there are any from the audience. There are some microphones around the room here, so we have two there. So if you'd like to come down, great. Mark?
Thank you, Erica. That's a fantastic lecture. So one thing that wasn't represented in that diagram showing the size of the outbreaks was dividing by the human population at the time, which would radically change the size of those spheres, right? Because I mean, the impact of the bubonic plagues, I mean, changed the course of human history. Whereas COVID-19, although it was painful to live through, it didn't have nearly the sort of impact as some of those prior outbreaks had.
Yeah. Yes. So many people say, especially people who work on disease, there's many things wrong with this visualization. And people get very excited about it. But your point about how what it doesn't take into as a frame of reference is what proportion of the population. And you're entirely right that it's an interesting point, and this is what I often think is interesting. How should we measure the impact of a pandemic, right? What are we looking for? And obviously we can think about overall mortality, and you're right that obviously a lot of this is, we will know, I know as historians, it's a kind of guesstimate, even to think about what the actual mortality is. We're often dealing with scattered records, especially smallpox. We're thinking, I think this is the smallpox in the Americas, the introduction there. We of course actually know that it's an interaction between various diseases. We don't know the full guesstimate. People have therefore guesstimated, should we just say it's 40% or 60% across all populations, when actually we know that different groups respond very differently to an outbreak of disease. So you're right that, and I think it's an interesting point as you were saying about COVID, how should we represent and capture the effect of disease? And I think people have often talked about numbers on their own. I remember when there was, I think, one of the American newspapers talked about the day when it was the same death toll as 1918 influenza. But again, it's a very different population number. It's a very different group of the population too, right? We know that one of the issues during the 1918 influenza pandemic was that it seemed to target young people. And that was particularly shocking to societies at the time. And so I think to me, it's this really interesting point about you can have numbers and the numbers can be right. But then the question is, what context do you put them in, and how do you actually measure the effect, whether it be social or demographic, of a particular disease? And that's why I think the example of plague in Colton, 20% of your entire population being lost is massive. I think it's very hard for us to kind of wrap our mind around that kind of demographic loss, and then the impact that that has on societies and economies and cultures in the long term.
Hello.
Hello.
So you mentioned a lot of how Epidemics End is like data-driven, and my question is on how big of an impact does the social or cultural aspect have, and if there's been instances in society where epidemics or plagues have been religiously attached or worshipped and then forced to continue because of those cultural ties.
Yeah, so it's partly thinking about cultural and social and religious aspects also, or impacts of the epidemic, have I understood your question correctly? I mean, one of the interesting things for historians who work on the history of disease and the history of epidemics, and something that I think is a bit different for how we talk about them, is historians tend to shy away from the notion that an epidemic changes society. What we often talk about is how what epidemics do, like many crises, is they reveal the workings of society. So they reveal the tensions that have likely been there all along. They reveal differences in terms of priorities and values. They reveal what are very important. And this is why I think historians are so fascinated to study epidemics, because it's a bit like all of these things that have been, lying underneath, latent perhaps, whether it be distrust of political authorities or relationship between communities or, say, racial tensions. Once you have a crisis like this, in some ways it's almost like you've lifted off the lid and you can see these things for the first time. So one of the things I'm very interested in is we tend to talk about epidemics as if they kind of come in like an alien from outer space and act on society and change things. And actually, it makes much more sense for us to think about how they're interacting with society, right? And they might reinforce or they might kind of antagonize some of those differences and some of those practices. But I find in general, what we tend to see is actually that all of those things were already happening in society, and what happens is they tend to be brought to the surface.
So where do we define a threshold where the epidemic is a crisis versus where you think it would be a blessing?
Great question. And so because one point I would say is, I'm a historian, so I think it's not my job to do the definition. What I'm interested in is looking at how societies in the past have done that definition. What I do think is interesting is what this question, right, comes back to this notion of what is an acceptable level of disease. I think we've seen a lot of debates about COVID and where we can see that, you know, you might have a different view from your mother, you might have a different view from your neighbor, from your professor. And what I find interesting about that is, although we use numbers to make those arguments, then there isn't really a quantitative threshold, right? That's much more a question about our values and our priorities. What is normal? What is acceptable? What do we want to live with? What do we not want to live with? So I would say that if we look through the historical record, what of course helps us to think through these decisions today is we see the variety of options available, right? People have lived with high levels of disease, they've lived with low levels of disease, they have different priorities, and I think that can help us in our discussions when we're trying to kind of negotiate and find an answer. But I would say my job as a historian is much more to think about those patterns rather than thinking about what my personal view would be on those levels. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Thank you again for your wonderful talk. I have to admit, I actually like this figure and I use it in my own teaching, although I do realize that it has, you know, as Brian pointed out, and some major deficiencies. So one of the things, I guess, what I'm always curious about when I look at this figure is, how do we take into account advancement in medicine and society? So 1918 versus COVID.
Yeah.
1918 in US, there was still 1 in 6 children who wouldn't reach the age of 5,
Yeah.
right? 1 in 1,600 now.
Yeah.
So is it possible to take those factors into account? Because
Yeah.
then this would look completely different, I think.
Yeah, I also think, so, look, I agree. I feel like I use this too in my teaching, and then I want to complicate it, right? Isn't that the fun thing that you want to do? Give something that seems straightforward and then make it all messy. And I think this is the point, is it's like a nice structure to hang things on. What I'm very interested in is the category of an epidemic, right? Because as you say, if we think about infant mortality, we're talking about generally what's called endemic disease. And that's what fascinates me, is endemic disease is all around us. And very often it can actually kill far more or debilitate or be one of the things that's interacting with infectious disease outbreaks to actually make it much more problematic. And so that's what I find so interesting in this portrayal, is these empty spaces, right? There is no such thing as a time without disease, just like there's no place that doesn't, right? We have a lot of disease, we have chronic disease. And so it always strikes me what's interesting here is the decision to focus on epidemics, and then this assumption that people have that there's somehow these periods where we're disease-free. And that, of course, is definitely not the case. And so I sometimes wonder if we were to rethink those supposed empty spaces, then, of course, we'd get, I think, a much better understanding of why we have these, what seem like these unusual surprises, right? Why do we have a sudden disease? And you think, well, it's not sudden. There's been other diseases that it's interacting with. So I think, but of course, this is the problem. It would just look so messy if we had everything on there. But I think infant mortality is a very good example of that kind of issue. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm kind of short. I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. One of the thoughts that crossed my mind as I was listening to you is, does this only apply to pathogenic epidemics? Or can you use your your framework that you've talked about of the medical, political, and social to apply to things that we call epidemics nowadays, like the opioid epidemic or diabetes or obesity, or do you think it's possible to take what you've shared and put it on a different lens of non-pathological?
Yeah, I would love that.
Epidemics.
But I agree with you that, and again, to me, I think there's the category of an epidemic is a very powerful one, right? And I think that's what I'm interested in. So when people say we have an opioid epidemic or an obesity epidemic, what they're saying is this is a problem. And I think that's interesting, right? That we suggest that something we used to not think is a problem, we've now defined as a problem, and so we need to do something about it. So it suggests a kind of urgency and it suggests a crisis. But I think you're right that then the question is, how are we framing that problem? And it's true that, of course, and I think this is the thing with chronic diseases, with endemic diseases, or even as we've seen with COVID, a very interesting point about how do you frame it? Do you see it linked to, say, obesity, or do you see it linked to respiratory issues, right? So you can even think about, these are different definitions of what kind of problem it is, but I think you're right that this category is so powerful in terms of mobilizing financial investments, political investments, but also I think public attention, right? And so that's the interesting point of what is the public interested in and what are they not? There's an anthropologist whose name escapes me, but who has a wonderful, Claire Herrick, I think her name is, and she talks about diseases of charisma. And her point is not so much that they're charming, but that they hold attention, right? So Ebola, people are fascinated by Ebola, even though, of course, their actual chance of engaging with anything with Ebola is very low, right? Whereas, say, a chronic disability does not have much charisma. And so it's a very interesting point about how campaigns very often are trying to think about how do you make something become interesting or become urgent or hold that charisma for a broader audience. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for a very informative talk. I have a question about resistance by society and how this might impact how we define the ending, whether politically or socially or medically, the pandemics. Do we have data on resistance by society in the past, the 16th, 17th, 14th century? Have people had to deal with this, or is this something, a new trend that we see?
And so you mean resistance to kind of political authority, public health?
Exactly, yeah.
It's all, as a typical historian, it's all been there before. Whatever you think is new has been going on forever. So yeah, so there's loads of accounts. One of the interesting things we can think about is it's really only in the 19th and 20th century that you start to see political authority being powerful enough to intervene in daily lives. So we know, for example, that in Renaissance Italy, they attempted to do these kind of brief lockdowns. It was very difficult to actually impose because, of course, you need a very large infrastructure to do so. So there's pockets of resistance, but when you really see the resistance arising is especially in the 19th and 20th century, because that's when medical and political authority actually have some kind of power. So there's very violent riots, especially there's cases in Europe during cholera outbreaks where doctors, medical authorities, and political officials were sometimes killed by the public crowds because, and we can think about how a lot of this had to do with, say, practices of needing to isolate family members, put them into a hospital where, as far as most family members were concerned, they never saw their relatives again. And so they were fighting against that. They did not trust the interventions. And so I think this is part of the thing that we want to think about, how the experience of the public health measures is often what's very divisive in epidemics. It's not just the experience of disease, it's about what it does to groups, because of course isolating individuals or structuring their lives, restructuring their lives is of course very antithetical to how we usually think about the role of communities and households. So there's been a lot of tension in that, and you can see in the historical record, it sometimes takes a long time for trust to be regained. So I would say this issue about whatever you might want to call it, protests. What is interesting is, of course, it was amazing to kind of see it during COVID, that it repeats on some of the cycles that you see about distrust and how that's handled and how social protests are handled.
Thank you. One of the things that piqued my interest was, as much as there's the medical and political and social aspects, there's also the psychological and behavioral aspects of epidemics, and kind of how do we think about that in terms of stigma and discrimination, and in terms of how that tends to linger on as pandemics end.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think it's interesting. So a lot of people have talked about how even though we don't necessarily live within a religious framework, a lot of our framework for thinking about responsibility, for thinking about who gets ill and what they've done to get ill, of course, is part of that notion. One of the things I found very interesting, so with Charles Rosenberg, the historian who kind of talks about this framework of uncertainty, is he points out that epidemics really are a moral crisis, because when we get ill, it's usually because we think we've done something wrong. And it was very interesting to me, I don't know how people felt, but especially during the early stages of COVID, the notion that if you got COVID, not only were you isolated, right, put in quarantine as a notion that you're kind of done something wrong, like a kind of punishment, but also that you feel culpable as if you've broken a rule, because the suggestion is you can control the spread. So I think there's an interesting point about responsibility and the morality that's tied up not only with being ill, but then also thinking about the spreading of illness, whether you're responsible for the spreading of an illness. And this has a very long history of thinking about how people think about infection and contagion, and the process of that quarantining, which of course is very similar to what people think of when they've done something wrong and they're being punished. So I think we should always, to me at least, it seems so obvious that disease and medicine still take place within a moral framework, right? That's what public health does, is it talks about responsibility and how to, do good. And so those things are bound in. That's why it's so powerful, and in some ways why the messages are so effective. But as you're saying, it also, of course, has this issue about the kind of lingering repercussions that people feel about whether they were responsible or whether this is something that's beyond their control.
Hi, thank you so much. You've cited Rosenberg quite a bit, and especially his attempt to graft the structure of an epidemic onto this dramaturgical model of like a well-made play.
Yeah.
And if I understand his model correctly and the conclusions of your talk, I think they're kind of at odds in terms of the way he proposes a return to normalcy. And I wonder if you could just expand upon a critique of that particular model.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that Rosenberg is kind of this, he's been around forever. That's how it feels when you're a historian. And I found it very interesting that these texts are key texts that I've been teaching, that I learned as a grad student, that I've been teaching to my students every year. And then you kind of went through and taught them during COVID, and they had this whole other meaning. To me, one of the really interesting points that Rosenberg lets us see is the role of humans in this, right? So I think part of his point when he says it's a drama is that he wants us to think not only about how we can compare and contrast all epidemics because they have similarities, which I think is very useful for researchers, but also that these are about humans having a drama as it's unfolding. But I think you're right that his focus is on very much what he calls this kind of drift towards closure. So if the process doesn't really happen, and I think what I find very interesting, at least in the research that we did, is that we found that there was so much disagreement, right? We found when we wanted to find some kind of sense, and I think, sorry to disappoint all the people who came here today who are thinking, she's going to tell us when and how the epidemic's going to end. There's going to be a kind of final spot, right? And so I think you're right that, of course, a drama has an ending. And in some ways, what he points to is it just happens off stage and we're no longer paying attention. But one of the things I just found so interesting in the research, and partly maybe it was working with 30 other researchers, but there wasn't agreement. And then I realized I think that is true because actually when you look around today, there's very different versions between nations, between institutions, between cultures. There's been very different approaches throughout. So I think I did think that actually this helped to capture some of the sense that people had, is that we might want to actually kind of embrace disagreement. Sometimes we're not comfortable with it. What we'd like is a nice, neat, tidy ending and a story that brings us together. But maybe the reality is that's not the case. Thanks.
So thank you, everybody. So on behalf of the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Arts, thank you, Professor Charters.
Thank you very much.